In the golden halls of Valdoria Palace, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on marble floors, 8-year-old Prince Alexander possessed a gift that could either save his kingdom or destroy it forever. Unlike other children who whispered secrets to their toys, Alexander's whispered words had the power to reveal truths that others desperately wanted to keep buried. When the young prince innocently repeated what the palace mirrors had shown him about the queen consort's hidden past, his simple statement would send shockwaves through the royal court, expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, and forever change the fate of the ancient kingdom of Valdoria. What started as an innocent child's observation during a formal state dinner would unravel decades of carefully constructed lies, challenge the legitimacy of the crown itself, and force a kingdom to confront the truth about the woman who had been positioned to become their future queen. But in a world where royal bloodlines determine the fate of nations, and where palace walls have ears that remember every secret whispered within them, young Prince Alexander was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a kingdom isn't a sword or a crown. It's the truth spoken by an innocent child who doesn't yet understand the weight of his words. The kingdom of Valdoria would never be the same again, and it all began with what a little prince said about the woman everyone believed they knew. The morning sun painted the spires of Valdoria Palace in shades of gold and amber as 8-year-old Prince Alexander Maximilian de Valdoria pressed his small face against the tall windows of the East Wing Library. His breath fogged the ancient glass as he watched the preparations for tonight's grand state dinner unfolding in the courtyard below. Servants in crisp uniforms hurried back and forth, carrying elaborate floral arrangements and polished silver that gleamed like stars in the early light. Alexander had always been different from other royal children, though the palace staff attributed his unusual behavior to an overactive imagination. What they didn't understand was that Alexander possessed a rare gift that had been dormant in the Valdorian royal bloodline for over 3 centuries. He could see reflections of truth in mirrors, windows, and any reflective surface, glimpses of past events, hidden emotions, and secrets that others believed were safely buried. The young prince had learned early to keep these visions to himself. The first time he had mentioned seeing his late grandmother, Queen Isabella, weeping in the silver tea service during a family gathering, his parents had exchanged worried glances and whisked him away to see the royal physician. Dr. Hensworth had declared him perfectly healthy, but perhaps a bit too imaginative for his own good. Since then, Alexander had kept his observations private, treating them like a secret game that only he could play. But today felt different. Today, the reflections seemed more urgent, more insistent. As Alexander traced patterns in the condensation on the window, he caught sight of a reflection that made his stomach clench with unease. In the glass, he saw not the bustling courtyard below, but a dimly lit room from long ago. A young woman with auburn hair that looked remarkably similar to Queen Consort Vivian's, stood over a bassinet, tears streaming down her face as she placed a bundle wrapped in common cloth into the arms of an elderly woman dressed in peasant clothing. The vision was so vivid that Alexander stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a stack of leather-bound books that his tutor, Master Aldrich, had left for his afternoon lessons. The crash echoed through the normally quiet library, and, within moments, the heavy oak doors swung open to reveal Alexander's personal guard, Sir Marcus Whitfield. "Your Highness, are you all right?" Sir Marcus asked, his weathered face creased with concern. At 52, Marcus had served the royal family for nearly 3 decades, first as a junior guard, and now as the prince's primary protector. He had watched Alexander grow from a curious toddler into an unusually perceptive child, and he had learned to recognize when something was troubling the young prince. "I'm fine, Sir Marcus," Alexander replied quickly, but his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his words. "I just saw something strange in the window." Marcus approached the window and peered out at the courtyard preparations. "What did you see, young prince? Is someone causing trouble down there?" Alexander hesitated. How could he explain that he hadn't been looking at the courtyard at all, but rather into the past? How could he describe the woman who looked so much like his stepmother, but younger and dressed in clothes far simpler than any royal would ever wear? "It was nothing," he said finally. just shadows playing tricks. But Sir Marcus had known Alexander long enough to recognize when the boy was keeping something to himself. Rather than press the issue, however, he simply nodded and helped the prince straighten the fallen books. "Perhaps you should prepare for this afternoon's etiquette lesson with Madame Du Bois," he suggested gently. "Tonight's dinner will require your best behavior, especially with the Eldorian delegation in attendance." The Kingdom of Eldoria had been Valdoria's closest ally for generations, and tonight's dinner would celebrate the renewal of their trade agreements. More importantly, it would be one of the first major state functions since King Ferdinand's marriage to Vivian Ashford 6 months earlier. The union had been celebrated throughout the kingdom as a fairy tale romance, the widowed king finding love again with a nobleman's daughter whose grace and charity work had made her beloved among the common people. Alexander nodded obediently and gathered his books, but as he prepared to leave the library, another reflection caught his eye. This time, it appeared in the polished surface of an ornate silver candlestick that had belonged to his biological mother, the late Queen Catherine. The vision showed the same auburn-haired woman from before, but now she stood in what appeared to be a modest cottage kitchen, her hands covered in flour as she kneaded bread. Her clothes were those of a commoner, simple, practical, worn from honest work. The young prince blinked hard, and the vision disappeared, leaving only his own confused reflection staring back at him. But the image lingered in his mind as he made his way through the palace corridors toward his private chambers. The woman in the visions bore such a striking resemblance to Queen Consort Vivian that it couldn't be mere coincidence. But what did it mean? Why was he seeing these glimpses of someone who looked like his stepmother living as a common peasant? As Alexander walked through the Hall of Portraits, where paintings of his ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, he tried to push the strange visions from his mind. But they seemed to follow him, appearing in every reflective surface he passed. In the polished marble floor, he saw the woman tending to a small garden behind the cottage. In a decorative mirror, he glimpsed her reading by candlelight to a young child, not in the elaborate royal nursery, but in a simple room with plain wooden furniture. By the time he reached his chambers, Alexander's head was spinning with questions he didn't know how to ask. His personal valet, James, helped him change into his formal afternoon attire, a small version of the court dress that his father and other male nobles wore for important occasions. The navy blue velvet jacket was embroidered with the Valdorian royal crest, and the matching breeches were paired with white silk stockings and polished black shoes that clicked against the marble floors. "You look quite handsome, Your Highness," James said with a smile as he adjusted the prince's collar. "Your father will be proud to present you to the Eldorian delegation tonight." Alexander managed a smile in return, but his thoughts remained troubled. As James led him toward the formal dining room where Madame Du Bois waited with her seemingly endless lessons on proper fork placement and conversation etiquette, the young prince couldn't shake the feeling that the visions were trying to tell him something important. Something about Queen Consort Vivian that the adults around him either didn't know or didn't want him to know. The afternoon etiquette lesson passed in a blur of instruction about which wine glass to use with which course and how to properly address visiting dignitaries. Madame Du Bois, a stern woman in her 60s who had served as etiquette instructor to 3 generations of Valdorian royalty, seemed satisfied with Alexander's performance, though she noted that he appeared somewhat distracted. "Young prince," she said as the lesson concluded, "tonight's dinner is of great importance to your father and the kingdom. The Eldorian delegates will be watching to see how our future king comports himself. You must be attentive, respectful, and, above all, think before you speak. Royal words carry weight, and even innocent comments can have far-reaching consequences." Her words proved more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. As evening approached, and the palace staff made their final preparations for the grand dinner, Alexander found himself drawn once again to reflective surfaces. In the silver serving dishes being carried past his door, he saw more glimpses of the mysterious woman's life. He watched her working in what appeared to be a village marketplace, selling vegetables from a simple wooden cart. He saw her caring for an elderly man who looked to be her father, bringing him soup and medicine in a cottage that couldn't have been more different from the opulent chambers of Valdoria Palace. The most disturbing vision came as Alexander was being dressed for dinner by his personal staff. In the polished buttons of his formal evening coat, he saw the woman, who looked exactly like Queen Consort Vivian, standing in a modest church, not as a bride in silk and jewels, but as a peasant woman in simple brown cloth, holding the hand of a man whose face Alexander couldn't quite make out. When his valet finished adjusting his appearance and declared him ready for the evening's festivities, Alexander stared at himself in his bedroom mirror. But instead of seeing his own reflection, he saw the woman again, this time holding a letter sealed with wax. Her hands shook as she read it, and tears began to stream down her face. The letter seemed to bring news that shattered her world, and as she crumpled it to her chest, Alexander could feel her despair as if it were his own. The vision faded just as Sir Marcus arrived to escort him to the state dining room, but the emotion lingered. As they walked through the corridors lined with tapestries depicting centuries of Valdorian history, Alexander struggled to understand what he was seeing and what it meant. The woman in his visions looked exactly like Queen Consort Vivian, but she lived a life that was completely different from anything the royal family had ever known. The state dining room had been transformed for the evening's celebration. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables set with the finest china, silver, and crystal that Valdoria Palace had to offer. Fresh flowers from the royal gardens created centerpieces that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and the room hummed with the quiet conversation of nobles and dignitaries dressed in their finest evening wear. King Ferdinand stood near the main table, resplendent in his formal military dress uniform decorated with the medals and honors he had earned during his younger years as a diplomat and, briefly, as a soldier during the border disputes with the neighboring kingdom of Moraval. At 45, he remained a commanding presence with his dark hair touched by distinguished silver at the temples and the bearing of a man born to lead. Beside him stood Queen Consort Vivian, elegant in a gown of midnight blue silk that brought out the auburn highlights in her carefully styled hair. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, jewels that had once belonged to Alexander's mother and were now worn by the woman who had taken her place. She smiled graciously at the assembled guests, every inch the perfect royal consort. But as Alexander watched her from across the room, all he could see were the visions of the simple peasant woman who looked exactly like her. The Eldorian delegation had arrived earlier in the afternoon, led by Duke Roderick Ashworth and his wife, Duchess Helena. They were accompanied by their trade minister, several nobles from their court, and a small retinue of guards and servants. The renewal of the trade agreements between their kingdoms would ensure continued prosperity for both nations, and tonight's dinner would celebrate not just commerce, but the enduring friendship between their peoples. As the guests took their places at the elegantly set tables, Alexander found himself seated between his tutor, Master Aldrich, and Lady Margaret Thornfield, one of his stepmother's ladies-in-waiting. The placement had been carefully considered to ensure that the young prince would have appropriate guidance throughout the evening, while still being visible to the important guests as the future heir to the throne. The dinner began with traditional toasts to the health of both kingdoms and the success of their continued partnership. Wine flowed freely among the adults while Alexander and the few other children present were served specially prepared fruit juices in crystal glasses that sparkled like the finest wine. The first course arrived with perfect timing, a delicate soup made from vegetables grown in the palace gardens, seasoned with herbs that had been cultivated by the royal kitchen staff for generations. As conversation flowed around the table, covering topics from trade routes to cultural exchanges to the upcoming harvest festival, Alexander found himself studying Queen Consort Vivian more intently than he ever had before. She laughed at appropriate moments, asked thoughtful questions about Eldorian customs, and demonstrated exactly the kind of grace and intelligence that had made her such a popular choice as his father's second wife. But the more Alexander watched her, the more convinced he became that she was the same woman from his visions. Every gesture, every expression, every subtle mannerism matched what he had seen in the reflective surfaces throughout the day. The only difference was the setting. Instead of a peasant cottage, she now presided over a royal palace. Instead of simple brown cloth, she wore silk and jewels. Instead of kneading bread with flour-covered hands, she delicately handled silver utensils worth more than most families would see in a lifetime. As the evening progressed through multiple courses of increasingly elaborate dishes, Alexander noticed that Queen Consort Vivian seemed to grow more nervous. She covered it well. Only someone watching as carefully as he would have noticed the slight tremor in her hands when she reached for her wine glass, or the way she occasionally touched the diamond necklace at her throat, as if it were a foreign object she wasn't accustomed to wearing. During the fourth course, a magnificent roasted duck served with seasonal vegetables and a sauce that the royal chefs had spent days perfecting, Duke Roderick raised his glass for an impromptu toast. "To our gracious hosts," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the dining room, "and especially to Queen Consort Vivian, whose reputation for kindness and charity has reached even our distant shores. We understand that your majesty grew up understanding the struggles of common folk, which makes your charity work all the more meaningful." The comment was meant as a compliment, but Alexander noticed that his stepmother's face went pale for just a moment before she recovered her composure and smiled graciously. "You're too kind, Your Grace," she replied. "I believe that understanding comes from the heart, not from experience." But, as she spoke, Alexander caught sight of his own reflection in the silver serving dish beside his plate. In that reflection, he saw not the current dinner party, but a memory. The same woman he now knew was definitely Vivian, but dressed in the rough clothes of a scullery maid, scrubbing floors in what looked like the servants' quarters of a large house. Her hands were red and chapped from harsh soap and cold water, and her hair hung loose and uncombed around her shoulders. The vision was so startling that Alexander gasped audibly, drawing the attention of Lady Margaret beside him. "Are you all right, Your Highness?" she whispered discreetly. Alexander nodded quickly, but his mind was reeling. The woman who now sat at the head table wearing diamonds and silk, who was married to his father and would someday help rule the kingdom, had once been a servant. The visions weren't showing him someone who merely looked like Queen Consort Vivian. They were showing him Queen Consort Vivian herself, living a completely different life than the one she now claimed. As the dinner continued and moved toward its final courses, Alexander found himself unable to focus on the conversations around him. The visions came faster now, as if the silver and crystal surrounding him were all reflecting the same hidden truth. He saw Vivian, though she must have had a different name then, working in stables, mucking out stalls, and caring for horses. He saw her serving ale in what appeared to be a tavern, wiping down wooden tables, and dodging the grabbing hands of drunken customers. He saw her sleeping on a thin mattress in a tiny room under the eaves of some great house, too exhausted from her labors to even remove her work clothes. But the most shocking vision came as dessert was being served, an elaborate creation of spun sugar and fresh berries that had been designed to look like a miniature version of Valdoria Palace. In the glossy surface of the chocolate decoration, Alexander saw Vivian as he had never imagined her, standing trial in what appeared to be a magistrate's court, her hands bound, tears streaming down her face as a stern man in judicial robes read from a scroll that seemed to condemn her for some crime Alexander couldn't understand. The vision was so vivid and disturbing that Alexander knocked over his water glass, sending crystal-clear liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. The accident drew immediate attention from the servants, who rushed to clean up the spill, but it also caught the eye of his father and stepmother at the head table. "Alexander," King Ferdinand called out with gentle authority, "is everything all right?" All conversation in the dining room stopped as every guest turned to look at the young prince. Alexander felt his face flush with embarrassment, but as he looked up to apologize to his father, his gaze fell on Queen Consort Vivian. In her eyes, he saw something that confirmed every vision he had experienced: fear. Not the mild concern of a stepmother for a clumsy child, but the deep, paralyzing fear of someone whose carefully constructed world was about to crumble. And in that moment of crystal-clear understanding, with the entire dining room waiting for his response, and his stepmother's terrified eyes locked on his, 8-year-old Prince Alexander opened his mouth and spoke the words that would change everything. "I'm sorry, father." I was just thinking about what it must be like for Queen Vivian to eat with real silver when she's used to wooden spoons. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the servants stopped their cleaning to stare at the young prince who had just made the most innocent and devastating observation in the history of the Valdorian royal court. The silence stretched across the state dining room like a taut wire ready to snap. Every crystal glass seemed to catch and hold the light as if time itself had stopped, waiting for someone to break the spell that Prince Alexander's innocent words had cast. Queen Consort Vivian's face had gone completely white, the rouge on her cheeks standing out like scarlet stains against parchment. Her diamond earrings caught the candlelight as her hands trembled almost imperceptibly where they rested on the table. King Ferdinand's expression shifted through several emotions in the span of seconds: confusion, embarrassment, and then a growing anger that any member of his family would speak so inappropriately at such an important state function. But before he could respond, Duke Roderick of Eldoria let out a hearty laugh that seemed to release some of the tension in the room. "Children do say the most amusing things," the Duke said with diplomatic grace. "I'm sure His Highness simply meant that Queen Vivian's humble nature makes her appreciate the finer things in life all the more. An admirable quality in any royal consort." Several other guests murmured their agreement, eager to smooth over what appeared to be nothing more than a child's awkward attempt at conversation. But Alexander could see that his words had struck far deeper than anyone realized. In the polished surface of his water glass, which a servant was quietly refilling, another vision flickered: Vivian as a young woman, maybe 16 or 17, being roughly escorted from a great house by stern-faced men while other servants watched from windows and doorways. Lady Margaret placed a gentle but firm hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Perhaps His Highness is tired from such a long day," she suggested quietly. "Children can become overwhelmed by formal occasions." But Alexander wasn't finished. The visions were coming faster now, more insistent, as if some force beyond his understanding was compelling him to speak the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. In the silver serving spoon beside his dessert plate, he saw Vivian, younger still, being turned away from the gates of various great houses, carrying a small bundle of possessions, her face gaunt with hunger and desperation. "She knows what it's like to be hungry," Alexander said suddenly, his young voice carrying clearly through the dining room. "She knows what it's like to sleep in the cold and to have holes in her shoes and to wonder where her next meal will come from." This time, the silence was different. It carried weight, gravity, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in the room. Queen Consort Vivian rose slowly from her chair, her silk gown rustling like autumn leaves. Her voice, when she spoke, was carefully controlled but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "Alexander, dear," she said, and the endearment sounded forced, "you have such a vivid imagination. Perhaps you've been reading too many fairy tales about poor girls who become princesses." But Prince Alexander shook his head, his dark eyes, so much like his father's, fixed on her with an intensity that was disturbing in someone so young. "It's not imagination," he said simply. "I can see it. I can see you when you were Vera, not Vivian. When you worked in the scullery at Thornwick Manor and slept in the servants' attic and had to steal bread when the cook wasn't looking because they didn't feed you enough." The name Vera fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread from guest to guest. Queen Consort Vivian gripped the back of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. Several of the Eldorian delegates exchanged meaningful glances, while the Valdorian nobles sat in stunned silence. Duke Roderick's diplomatic smile faltered for the first time that evening. "I beg your pardon, Your Highness," he said carefully. "But did you say Thornwick Manor? Are you referring to the Thornwick estate in the northern provinces of Eldoria?" King Ferdinand stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Alexander, that's enough," he said sharply. "You will apologize to Queen Vivian immediately, and then retire to your chambers." But before Alexander could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. Master Aldrich, the prince's tutor, had been sitting quietly throughout the exchange, but now he leaned forward with the careful expression of someone who had just connected several troubling dots. Your Majesty, he said hesitantly. If I may, there was indeed a serving girl named Vera who worked at Thornwick Manor approximately 15 years ago. I remember the case because it became something of a scandal. She was accused of theft and dismissed without references. There was talk that she had disappeared after the accusation. The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy and impossible to ignore. Queen Consort Vivian's carefully composed facade was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of something raw and desperate underneath. This is preposterous, she said, her voice rising slightly. A child's fantasy is being treated as fact. I am Lady Vivian Ashford, daughter of Sir Edmund Ashford of Willowbrook Estate. My credentials have been thoroughly verified. This is nothing more than. Then, why are you afraid? Alexander interrupted, his young voice cutting through her protests like a blade. Why are your hands shaking? Why do you keep touching your necklace like it doesn't belong to you? Why do you sometimes forget which fork to use when you think no one is watching? The questions came rapid fire, each one more devastating than the last. And, with each question, more visions flashed in the reflective surfaces around him. He saw Vivian, or Vera, practicing walking with books balanced on her head in a tiny, candlelit room. He saw her studying etiquette manuals by firelight, moving her lips as she memorized proper forms of address. He saw her practicing curtsies and formal speech patterns until her feet bled and her throat was raw. But, most shocking of all, he saw her meeting with a man in expensive clothes in what appeared to be a private study. The man handed her documents, papers that looked official and important, while explaining something that made her face pale with fear or excitement. In the vision, Alexander could see money changing hands, lots of it, more than a servant girl could ever hope to earn honestly. She bought her identity, Alexander said suddenly, the words spilling out before he fully understood their significance. Someone helped her become Vivian Ashford. The real Vivian is. He stopped, his young face scrunched in concentration as he tried to understand what the visions were showing him. In the crystal water glass, he saw a grave marker, weathered and old, with a name carved in fading letters. Vivian Ashford, beloved daughter, taken too soon. The real Vivian is dead, he finished quietly. The impact of his words was immediate and devastating. Several guests gasped audibly, while others began whispering urgently among themselves. The Eldorian delegation looked deeply uncomfortable, as if they found themselves unwilling witnesses to a family scandal that could have international implications. King Ferdinand appeared to be struggling between anger at his son's behavior and growing alarm at what the boy was revealing. But it was Queen Consort Vivian herself who provided the most telling reaction. Instead of continuing to protest her innocence or demanding that the outrageous accusations be stopped, she simply stood there, swaying slightly, her face cycling through expressions of fear, despair, and something that might have been relief. Sir Marcus Whitfield stepped forward from his position near the wall, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his ceremonial sword. As the prince's personal guard, his primary duty was to protect Alexander. But the current situation presented a complex challenge. Was the threat to the young prince physical, political, or something else entirely? Your Majesty, Sir Marcus said carefully, addressing King Ferdinand. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued in private. But, before the king could respond, Duke Roderick spoke up again, his diplomatic training warring with his obvious curiosity. Actually, Your Majesty, if I may, this matter may be of concern to Eldoria as well. Thornwick Manor is one of our most prominent estates. If there are questions about the identity of your queen consort, particularly involving criminal activity on Eldorian soil, we may need to address this through official channels. The suggestion sent a chill through the room. What had begun as a child's strange comments during dinner was rapidly escalating into a potential international incident. Trade agreements, diplomatic relations, and the stability of both kingdoms could be at stake. Queen Consort Vivian finally found her voice again, but when she spoke, something fundamental had changed. The carefully modulated tones of royal bearing were gone, replaced by something rawer, more desperate. You don't understand, she said, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for escape routes. None of you understand what it's like to have nothing, to be nothing, to know that you're smart enough and capable enough to be more than what you were born to be, but to be trapped by circumstances you can't control. Her accent had shifted too, subtle vowels and consonants revealing origins far humbler than the noble background she claimed. The change was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to listen for such things. "I never hurt anyone," she continued, her voice growing stronger as if confession was liberating her. "I took nothing that wasn't owed to me. They worked me 16 hours a day at Thornwick Manor, paid me barely enough to survive, and when the master's son tried to, She stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to her throat. "When I defended myself, they accused me of theft to cover their own shame." The room was completely silent now, every guest hanging on her words. Even the servants had stopped their quiet movements, standing frozen with serving dishes and wine bottles in their hands. "I had nowhere to go," Vivian continued, her carefully constructed royal facade crumbling with each word. "No family, no references, no hope of honest work. I would have starved, or worse if I hadn't." She looked directly at Alexander, and, for the first time, he saw not fear in her eyes but a kind of desperate honesty. "If I hadn't met someone who offered me a chance to become someone else." King Ferdinand finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Who helped you?" But before Vivian could answer, Alexander spoke again. The visions were cascading now, coming so fast and clear that he felt almost dizzy trying to process them all. "Lord Blackwood," he said. "Lord Cedric Blackwood helped her. He needed someone who could pass as nobility, someone who was smart and desperate enough to do anything he asked. He had debts, gambling debts, and he needed to marry into the royal family to access the crown treasury." The name sent another shockwave through the room. Lord Cedric Blackwood was one of King Ferdinand's most trusted advisors, a man who had been instrumental in arranging the marriage between the king and the woman they knew as Vivian Ashford. He had vouched for her background, provided character references, and smoothed over any questions about her relatively obscure family connections. "That's impossible," King Ferdinand said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Cedric has been my friend since childhood. He would never. He's been embezzling from the royal treasury for years," Alexander said, the words flowing from him as clearly as if he were reading from a book. "Taking small amounts that wouldn't be noticed immediately, but it added up. He owed money to dangerous people who would have killed him if he couldn't pay. When the real Vivian Ashford died in a carriage accident 2 years ago, he saw an opportunity. In the silver surface of a serving dish, Alexander could see it all playing out like scenes from a play. Cedric Blackwood, desperate and panicked, meeting with the woman who called herself Vera in a tavern in one of the kingdom's seedier districts. The negotiation, the exchange of money and documents, the intensive training sessions where she learned not just to act like a noble, but to become one. He taught her everything," Alexander continued, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "How to walk, how to talk, how to manage servants, how to appear charitable and kind without actually caring about the people she was supposed to help. But, most importantly, he taught her how to influence father, how to make him fall in love with an illusion." Queen Consort Vivian, or Vera, or whoever she truly was, had sunk back into her chair, her head in her hands. When she looked up, her face was streaked with tears that had destroyed her carefully applied cosmetics, revealing the plain features underneath. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said quietly. "I was supposed to marry him, produce an heir, and then we would have had access to everything. The treasury, the crown lands, the trade revenues. Cedric promised me half of everything if I could make it work. But you didn't count on me," Alexander said, and for the first time that evening, his voice carried the weight of someone far older than his 8 years. "You didn't count on someone who could see the truth." The implications of the revelation were staggering. The Queen Consort of Valdoria was a fraud, a criminal who had assumed a false identity with the help of a trusted advisor who was himself stealing from the crown. The marriage that had been celebrated throughout the kingdom as a fairy tale romance was nothing more than an elaborate confidence scheme designed to loot the royal treasury. But even as the truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire that could not be extinguished, new questions arose. What would happen to the kingdom now? Could the marriage be annulled? Would Vivian face trial for her deception? Would Lord Blackwood be arrested for treason? And what of the diplomatic complications with Eldoria, whose trust had been violated by the presence of a criminal fugitive at the highest levels of Valdorian society? As if summoned by the enormity of the revelation, the heavy doors of the state dining room swung open to admit Captain Henrik Nordstrom, the commander of the Royal Guard. His face was grim, and he carried himself with the bearing of a man bringing urgent news. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing briefly to King Ferdinand, "I apologize for the interruption, but there has been a development that requires your immediate attention. Lord Blackwood has been found dead in his chambers. It appears to be suicide, but he left behind a confession that—" Captain Nordstrom paused, his eyes taking in the scene before him, the stunned guests, the weeping woman at the head table, and the young prince who sat in the center of it all like the eye of a storm. "A confession that details a conspiracy involving the royal marriage and the theft of crown funds," he finished quietly. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and, with it, the realization that what had begun as an innocent child's observation at dinner had uncovered a plot that reached to the very heart of the kingdom. Lord Blackwood, faced with exposure and the certainty of a traitor's death, had chosen to end his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. But his death left even more questions unanswered, and as the shocked silence settled over the state dining room once again, everyone present understood that they had witnessed not just the revelation of a royal scandal, but the beginning of a crisis that would reshape the kingdom of Valdoria forever. And, through it all, 8-year-old Prince Alexander sat quietly, his strange gift having exposed a truth that adults had failed to see, wondering if his innocent words had saved his kingdom or destroyed it.